Here's the revised passage with your requested changes. The grit of the Texas Panhandle wasn't just in the dust that coated your tongue. It was in the souls of the men who hunted there. They weren't hunting buffalo or coyote that day. They were hunting a woman. His woman. From the back of a painted war pony, she watched them come, a dark tide of vengeance led by the very man who had shattered her body. Yet the arms that held her fast belonged not to a husband, but to a Comanche warrior, his face a mask of stone. As the posse's shouts grew louder, she felt a tremor of fear, not for the warrior, but for the moment he might let her go. The world was a blur of ochre dust and screaming pain. Lena Hart clung to the bare back of the Apache pony, every jarring stride sending a fresh wave of agony through her torso. The warrior's arm, as hard as sun-baked timber, was a vice around her waist. It was this pressure, this unyielding grip, that forced the whisper from her raw throat. "My ribs are already broken." She breathed the words stolen by the wind. She didn't know if he heard or understood. His focus was entirely on the horizon behind them, on the churning cloud of dust that grew larger with each passing second. That cloud was Buck Kane, her husband, and behind him rode the men of Redemption Gulch, their loyalty bought with Buck Kane's whiskey and silver. They thought they were on a rescue mission, chasing a savage who had stolen the wife of the town's most prominent rancher. Lena knew better. This wasn't a rescue. It was a hunt, and she was the fox. The warrior, whose name she did not know, shifted his weight, urging the pony down into a shallow arroyo, the sudden dip stealing her breath. His body shielded hers from the open plain, his heat a strange and unwelcome comfort. He was all sinew and leather, smelling of sage and horse and something else, something wild and clean that the men who pursued them had long since sweated out. His grip tightened, not with cruelty, but with a grim purpose. He was holding her together literally. The tight wrap of his arm was the only thing that seemed to keep the shattered pieces of her ribs from grinding against each other. It was an intimacy more profound and terrifying than any she had ever known. They had been riding for hours since the hazy light of dawn. He had appeared from the shimmering heat like a ghost. Lena had been at the well, the morning air cool on the bruises that painted her face and arms when his shadow fell over her. There was no war cry, no brutal charge. He had simply dismounted, his movements economical and silent. He had looked at the marks on her skin, then at the sprawling Kane ranch house behind her, and a flicker of something recognition, perhaps pity, had crossed his stern features. Before she could scream, not out of fear of him, but of the certainty of Buck's wrath, he had lifted her. She was shockingly light. He'd set her on his pony, mounted behind her, and spurred the animal into a gallop, heading straight for the unforgiving expanse of the Llano Estacado. Now that expanse was their only hope. The posse was gaining. She could hear the baying of Gus Beal's hounds, a sound she associated with cornered animals. Buck would be at the forefront, his face a mask of righteous fury for the public, his eyes burning with the private rage of a man whose property had been stolen. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't afford to let her live to tell her tales. The Apache warrior guided the horse with his knees, his hands steady. He was a master of this land, weaving through mesquite and rock formations that would have broken the leg of a less certain animal. He flinched, expecting a blow, a curse. It was a reflex honed by 2 years of marriage to Buck Kane. Instead, he subtly adjusted his arm, his fingers finding the space just below the worst of the break, lessening the direct pressure. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but to Lena it was a revelation. It was an act of consideration, of care. The posse's shouts were clearer now, carried on the wind. "He's in the wash." That was Gus Beal's voice, a gravelly roar. The warrior urged the horse faster. The animal's lungs worked like bellows. He leaned forward, his long black hair whipping against Lena's cheek. He whispered something, not to her, but to the horse, a stream of low, guttural sounds that were both a prayer and a command. He was not her captor. She was beginning to understand that, with terrifying clarity. The man behind her, the silent command, he who held her broken body together, was shielding her. The cruelty she was fleeing wasn't in the wildness of the plains ahead, but in the civilized savagery of the men hunting them down. He was her only shield, and he was riding them straight into the heart of a territory from which no white woman was ever said to return. 2 years earlier, Lena Hart had arrived in Redemption Gulch as a bride from St. Louis, her head filled with romantic notions of the West. Buck Kane had courted her by letter, his prose as polished as the silver buttons on his waistcoat. He wrote of building an empire, taming the land, and needing a queen to share his throne. Lena Hart's father, a merchant whose fortunes were failing, saw the match as a godsend. Buck Kane in person was even more impressive. He was handsome with a powerful build and a voice that could charm a rattlesnake. The town of Redemption Gulch revolved around him. His ranch Kane Dominion was the largest in the territory, his cattle herds legendary. When he rode down the town's single dusty street, men removed their hats. When he smiled at Lena, her heart fluttered. But that illusion shattered on their wedding night. The charm was a veneer, a mask for a possessiveness so absolute it suffocated her. His love was not warmth, but a fire that sought to consume. He saw her not as a partner, but as his most prized possession, more valuable than his finest bull or his fastest horse, to be treated with the same sense of absolute ownership. And he perceived a conversation with the blacksmith that went on too long. A smile at the stable hand, a dress he deemed too colorful, was met with a cold, terrifying silence that would inevitably break into a storm of verbal and then physical abuse. The broken ribs were the culmination of his latest rage. He had discovered she had been teaching one of the ranch hands, young Cody Miller, how to read. "You will not fill the heads of my help with ideas above their station." Buck had hissed, his voice low and menacing, dragging her from the small schoolhouse she'd set up in a disused shed. In the privacy of their opulent bedroom, a room filled with fine furniture, shipped all the way from New Orleans, he showed her the price of her defiance. The first blow had knocked the wind out of her. The second sent her crashing into the heavy oak bedpost. She'd felt the sharp, sickening crack in her side. He had stood over her, his chest heaving, his face contorted, not with anger, but with a kind of righteous satisfaction. "Let this be a lesson," Buck had said, straightening his tie. "You are Mrs. Buck Kane. Your world is this house. Your duty is to me. Do not forget it again." He left her on the floor, gasping for breath, the pain of white-hot fire in her chest. The next morning he acted as if nothing had happened, ordering the cook, Rosa, to bring her a special breakfast in bed, and instructing the doctor, a man deep in Buck's pocket, to diagnose her with a bad fall. That was Buck Kane's particular brand of cruelty. It was always private, always deniable. To the world he was the doting husband concerned for his delicate wife. To Lena he was the architect of a gilded cage, and its bars were her own bruised flesh. She knew that any attempt to flee, any cry for help, would be dismissed as the hysterics of a fragile woman. Buck had made sure of that. He had insulated himself with a wall of influence and money. Who would believe her over the great Buck Kane miles away, and years before the warrior who called himself Black Hawk had known a different kind of pain? His name meant wanderer in the tongue of the Numunu people. He had not always been a wanderer. He had once had a place, a family. His band, a small group of Quahati Apache, had tried to live peacefully on the edge of the white man's world. They traded hides for flour and coffee, holding to the old ways as the tide of settlers rose around them. Black Hawk had a wife, a quiet woman named Talia, and a young son, Moss, whose laughter was the brightest thing in his life. Then the surveyors had come. They were led by a hard-faced man with cold eyes, a man who spoke of lines on a map that superseded the claims of sky and earth. They said the land had been sold to a cattle baron. They offered a pittance for the band to move on. When Black Hawk's uncle, the chief, refused, the surveyors left, promising to return. They returned not with papers, but with rifles. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. They came, and at the time Lena was taken, set fire to the lodges. Black Hawk had fought with the fury of a cornered wolf, but they were too many. He saw Talia cut down as she ran with their son. He saw Moss fall, a bullet tearing through his shoulder and another grazing his temple, sending him into darkness. He awoke to silence and smoke. Everyone was gone. The surveyors had been thorough. He buried his family with his bare hands, the grief a stone in his chest that would never dissolve. He learned later from a sympathetic man who had paid the surveyors for their bloody work. Buck Kane came. Black Hawk became a ghost, a wanderer on the plains that had once been his home. He watched the white man's world with cold, patient hatred. He watched the grand ranch house being built on the ashes of his village, and he watched the beautiful, sad woman who lived there. He saw her from distance, her shoulders slumped, her eyes holding a familiar shadow of pain. He saw Buck Kane's public displays of affection and the way she flinched from his touch. One evening, crouched in the scrub overlooking the ranch, he saw through a telescope stolen from a cavalry patrol the scene by the schoolhouse. He saw Buck drag her away. He knew with an instinct honed by a lifetime of reading the signs of predators what would happen next. He wasn't driven by a desire to save her, not in the way the white men would understand it. He was driven by a need to defy Buck Kane to take something from the man who had taken everything from him. And in the woman's haunted eyes, he saw the ghost of his own people trapped and brutalized by a man who believed the world was his to own. Taking her was an act of war. It was an act of justice. It was the only act he had left. The Llano Estacado, the staked plains, was a sea of grass that stretched to an endless horizon. It was a place that broke men and swallowed armies. To Lana, it was a terrifying void. To Black Hawk, it was a sanctuary. He knew its secrets, the hidden seeps where water bubbled from the earth, the buffalo wallows that held rainwater, the drawers and canyons that offered shelter from the punishing sun and sweeping winds. He moved across this landscape not as a trespasser, but as a part of it, his senses alive to every shift in the wind, every track in the dust. For 2 days they traveled. The posse fell behind their clumsy, water-dependent pursuit, no match for Black Hawk's intimate knowledge of the land. But they did not give up. At night, Lena could sometimes see the faint orange glimmer of their campfire, a distant and menacing star on the black horizon. Her pain gradually subsided from a roaring fire to a dull, persistent ache. Black Hawk was a surprisingly gentle nurse. He had a pouch of dried leaves, yarrow she thought, which he crushed and mixed with water to make a poultice for her bruises. He tore strips from his own spare tunic to bind her ribs, his touch firm and impersonal, yet careful. He shared his meager rations of jerky and dried berries, without a word, always ensuring she ate first. Communication was a silent language of gestures, a nod toward a water source, a hand held up to signal a halt, a pointed finger at a circling hawk, a silent warning. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tension in his shoulders that meant he sensed danger, the slight relaxation that meant they were safe for the moment. She found herself watching him, this silent, grim man. He was not the grunting savage of the penny dreadfuls. There was a profound and sorrowful intelligence in his eyes. When he looked at the land, it was with a look of reverence, of belonging. When he looked at her, it was with an unnerving perception, as if he could see the bars of the cage she had just escaped. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a rock overhang, she found her voice. Why? The word was a croak. Black Hawk was sharpening the head of a spear with a piece of flint. He didn't look up, but he paused his work. Why did you take me? She clarified, her voice stronger. He set down the spearhead and finally met her gaze. He held up his hand and touched the fading yellow and purple bruise on his own to the one on hers. Then he pointed back in the direction from which they had come, toward the Kane Dominion, toward Buck Kane. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was vast and unequivocal. I saw. I know. A wave of emotion so powerful, it buckled Lena's knees, washed over her. For 2 years her suffering had been invisible, her reality denied by everyone around her. This man, this stranger, this supposed enemy, had seen the truth from a distance. In that moment, he felt less like a captor and more like the only witness she had ever had. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back streamed down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Back in Redemption Gulch, Buck Kane was orchestrating a masterpiece of public theater. He had ridden back into town, his face a perfect mask of grief and fury. "She's mine," he'd bellowed from the steps of the saloon, his voice breaking with practiced despair. An Apache buck snatched her right from the well. "We have to get her back," he'd shouted. He offered a reward of $500 for her safe return and $100 for the warrior's scalp. Men who had never ventured farther than the county line suddenly became seasoned trackers. Gus Beal Buck's brutish ranch foreman organized the posse, his loyalty absolute. Only one man in town was immune to the hysteria of Marshall Grant. Grant was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. He had served as a Texas Ranger before settling into the quieter but no less complicated job of keeping the peace in Redemption Gulch. He was methodical, observant, and deeply skeptical of easy answers. He had ridden out to the Kane Dominion to investigate the scene of the abduction. Something felt wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, not a single overturned bucket, not a scuff mark in the dirt, to suggest a woman had been dragged away fighting for her life. Furthermore, when he discreetly questioned Rosa, the Kane's Mexican cook, her eyes had been filled with a fear that seemed directed more at her employer than any Apache. Mrs. Kane Rosa had whispered, twisting her apron. "She had a bad fall yesterday. A bad fall." Marshall Grant had seen the results of bad falls on ranch wives before. They rarely involved a single Apache appearing out of nowhere the next morning. Now as he rode with the posse, he watched Buck Kane. The man was playing his part beautifully, shouting encouragement, pointing out imagined tracks, whipping his men into a frenzy. But Marshall Grant noticed something in Buck's eyes, cold and calculating. There was no desperate fear for a beloved wife in those eyes. There was only the grim determination of a hunter closing in on his quarry. Buck wasn't trying to rescue Lena. He was making sure she was silenced for good, and he was using an entire town to help him do it. Grant slowed his horse, letting the main body of the posse ride ahead. He dismounted and examined the ground. The tracks of the Apache pony were clear, but alongside them, he saw something else, the faint, almost erased tracks of a second horse that had been tethered in the scrub nearby for a long time. This wasn't a snatch and grab. The warrior had been watching the Kane Dominion waiting. The question wasn't just why the Apache had taken her. The question was why he had chosen that specific morning to do it. The morning after her bad fall. Grant mounted his horse, a cold knot of certainty tightening in his gut. The story Buck Kane was selling, the story the whole town had bought, was a lie, and the truth was somewhere out on the Llano Estacado, riding with a broken woman and a lone Apache warrior. Black Hawk led them to a place that seemed impossible in the flat emptiness of the plains. A deep, narrow fissure sliced through the caprock, hidden until you were nearly upon it. They descended a winding, rocky path into a canyon oasis. A small stream, fed by an underground spring, trickled through a grove of cottonwood trees. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wild plums. It felt like a secret world. Here, for the first time since the chase began, they were truly safe. The canyon was easily defensible and nearly impossible to find by chance. For a week they remained. The rhythm of their days was simple. Black Hawk would hunt a rabbit, a brace of quail, with a quiet efficiency that amazed Lena. He moved through the canyon like a spirit, never wasting a motion. He showed her which plants were edible, which roots held water, how to weave cordage from yucca fibers. He wasn't teaching her as a master teaches a student, but as one survivor sharing knowledge with another. The silence between them began to fill with words. His English was broken, learned from traders and soldiers, but his meaning was often clearer than the flowery, deceitful speeches she was used to. "This land," he said one evening, gesturing to the canyon walls, painted gold by the setting sun, was home for my people. He told her his story in fragments, the narrative pieced together over several nights by the light of a small smokeless fire. He spoke of the village that had stood where the Cain dominion now sprawled. He spoke of the surveyors, of his wife Talia and his son Moss. He did not cry, but a desolate emptiness entered his eyes that was more profound than tears. And then he spoke the name. Buck Cain, he said the words, tasting like poison. He paid for the guns, for the fire, for my family. Lena stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Her husband's empire was built on a foundation of blood and ash. The cruelty she had endured was just a small private echo of a much larger, more monstrous violence. I didn't know, she whispered the words, feeling pitifully inadequate. Blackhawk looked at her, his gaze intense. You know now. It was a statement, not an accusation. He was right. She did know, and that knowledge was both a burden and a weapon. He keeps a book, she said, her voice barely audible, a ledger in his study, behind a false panel in the wall. Blackhawk's eyes narrowed. I saw it once. He thought I was asleep. It's not just land deeds. It's payments, names, dates, surveying fees to a man named Gus Beale. Payments for clearing the land. She finally understood what that euphemism meant. It meant clearing the people. Her husband wasn't just a brute. He was a murderer on a grand scale. That book, she continued, a spark of defiance igniting within her. It proves everything. It proves what he did to your people. And to others he's cheated and killed his way across this whole territory. A new understanding passed between them. This was no longer just about her escape or his revenge. It was about justice, the kind of justice that couldn't be found in the corrupt courthouse in Redemption Gulch. This book, Blackhawk said, his voice low. Where is it? Lena looked down at her simple, dirt-stained dress. Before she had gone to the well that fateful morning, after Buck had left her broken on the floor, she had done something born of pure, desperate instinct. She had retrieved the ledger. It was a slim volume, and she had torn out the most incriminating pages. Then with a needle and thread she painstakingly stitched them into the lining of her petticoat. She had been planning something, an escape, perhaps a desperate plea to the law. But she hadn't known how. She met his eyes. I have it, she said. I have the proof. Blackhawk stared at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than grief or grim determination in his face. It was a sliver of hope, sharp, dangerous, and bright. Her personal hell had just collided with his, and in the wreckage they had found a common cause. She was no longer just a victim he was shielding. She was a witness, and she carried the weapon that could finally bring down the man who had destroyed both their worlds. Marshal Grant was a patient man. While the rest of the posse charged ahead, fueled by Buck Cain's whiskey and promises of reward money, Grant lingered. He was not tracking an Apache. He was unraveling a crime. And the more he circled the edges of the official story, the more it frayed. He found their first camp. It was neat, the fire pit small and expertly concealed. He found the remnants of a poultice. Picking it up, he recognized the distinct smell of yarrow. It was used for treating wounds and swelling. It confirmed his suspicion that Lena was injured before her supposed abduction. His investigation took him on a wide loop back toward Redemption Gulch, following a hunch. He visited the small homestead of the Miller family, whose land bordered the vast Cain dominion to the east. Old Man Miller was a cantankerous but honest man who had no love for his powerful neighbor. Buck's been trying to buy me out for years, he grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Grant's boot. Once my stream, I keep saying no. Funny thing though, my fences keep getting cut. A couple of my cows get sick. My boy Cody Miller, he used to do chores for Buck, but he got sent packing last week. Why was that? Grant asked, keeping his tone casual. Buck's missus was teaching him his letters. Miller's wife, May Hale, chimed in from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. A sweeter woman you'll never meet. Always had a kind word, but frail and sad. like a bird in a cage. Buck Kane caught her with Cody, and he had a look on his face. "Marshal," May Hale continued, "a look I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Sent the boy home right quick. We ain't seen her outside since." That was the day before she was taken. The pieces were falling into place. A kind woman defies her powerful husband. The husband explodes in a rage. The woman sustains an injury she has to call a bad fall. The next morning, she disappears. Grant thanked the Millers and rode on his jaw tight. He was no longer just a peace officer. He was the only man standing between Lena Hart and her husband. He was sure now that Buck Kane's posse wasn't a rescue party. It was a death squad. Buck needed to ensure his wife never spoke to anyone in authority. He was using the hunt for the Apache as a cover to murder his own wife and pin the blame on her savage. The marshal's conscience, a thing he had thought hardened by years of frontier justice, was a lead weight in his stomach. He had upheld the law his whole life. But what did the law mean when it was being wielded as a weapon by the rich and powerful? What was his duty to rescue a woman and hand her back to her tormentor, to a man who would surely kill her or find her first and listen to her side of the story? He looked out across the Llano Estacado. It was a vast, intimidating place. The Apache and Lena could be anywhere, but Grant knew the land too. He knew the likely places for water and shelter. He knew about a place the old-timers called the Canyon of Whispers, a hidden fissure in the rock that was a traditional refuge for those fleeing the law or injustice. He turned his horse, leaving the posse's trail behind. He would not be a pawn in Buck Kane's game. He would be a marshal of the law, and the law demanded the truth. He rode alone, guided by a compass of conviction. His hunt no longer for a fugitive, but for a witness. He prayed he would find her before Buck did. The peace of the canyon was shattered by the distant sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing off the rock walls. Black Hawk, who had been teaching Lena how to set a snare, froze. His head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He grabbed his bow and a handful of arrows, his movements fluid and silent. "They found us," Lena whispered, her blood turning to ice. "Not found," Black Hawk corrected her. His eyes scanned the rim of the canyon high above. "Found the canyon. Not us. Stay here. Do not make a sound." Black Hawk melted into the trees, and rocks disappearing as if the earth had swallowed him. Lena's heart hammered against her healing ribs. She scrambled behind a thicket of wild plums, her hands trembling. She could hear them now, the jingle of harnesses, the dislodged clatter of rocks, and the gruff voices of men. "Spread out!" It was Gus Beale's voice, raw and impatient. "She's in here somewhere. Buck Kane wants the woman alive if possible. The buck he just wants. Dead." Lena pressed herself flatter against the ground, praying she stayed alive if possible. The words sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Buck Kane wanted her back. He wanted the satisfaction of finishing what he'd started, of breaking her completely before discarding her. She heard the telltale hiss of an arrow, followed by a choked cry and the heavy thud of a body falling. A volley of rifle fire erupted in response bullets, thudding into the trees around her, splintering bark and shredding leaves. Black Hawk was a ghost among them, striking and vanishing, using his knowledge of the terrain to sow chaos. But he was one man against a dozen. The gunshots grew closer. She could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth, cursing and shouting. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the din, sharp and authoritative. Hold your fire, damn you." Lena saw Marshal Grant, his horse picking its way down the treacherous path. He had his pistol drawn, but it was pointed at the sky. "Gus Beale, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You're firing blind." "You'll hit the woman," the marshal yelled. But Gus, a bear of a man with a stained beard, lowered his rifle, a sneer on his face. "Just following orders, Marshal. Buck Kane wants his wife back. This isn't a rescue, it's a massacre." Grant retorted, his eyes sweeping the canyon. "Where's Buck?" He's waiting up top, Gus grunted. Didn't want to risk the path, said we were to bring her to him. Just then, a twig snapped behind Lena. She spun around to see two of Gus's men grinning at her, their rifles leveled. Well, look what we have here, one of them said, his eyes lingering on her torn dress. The little lost bird. Before they could grab her, an arrow sprouted from the man's chest. He stared down at its, stunned disbelief spreading across his face before he crumpled to the ground. The second man swung his rifle around, but Black Hawk was already there, dropping from a low-hanging branch like a panther. He drove his knife into the man's side, a swift, brutal, and silent motion. Black Hawk grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her to her feet. We go. Now they were exposed. Gus and the other men saw them and raised their rifles. There they are, Gus shouted. But before they could fire, Marshal Grant spurred his horse directly between them and the posse. Stand down, I said. Grant roared, his pistol now aimed squarely at Gus Beale's chest. This is official Marshal's business now. I will have the truth of this matter. Gus hesitated, his face a mask of confusion and rage. He was loyal to Buck Kane's money, but shooting a U.S. Marshal was a hanging offense. That moment of hesitation was all Black Hawk needed. He pulled Lena along, scrambling up the far side of the canyon wall, using handholds and paths that seemed invisible. Bullets whizzed past them, sparking off the rocks. They were nearing the top when a figure appeared on the rim, silhouetted against the bright sky. It was Buck. He held a rifle and his face was a portrait of pure hatred. He wasn't looking at Black Hawk. His eyes were fixed on Lena. You ungrateful whore! Buck screamed, his voice echoing across the canyon. The charming facade stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. You thought you could run from me. He raised the rifle, taking careful aim. Lena froze, paralyzed by the sight of the man who had haunted her every waking moment. This was it. The end. Black Hawk acted without thinking. He shoved her hard, sending her tumbling behind a rocky outcrop out of the line of fire. In the same motion, he drew his bow, nocked an arrow, and let it fly. It was a desperate long-distance shot. Buck Kane fired at the same instant. Lena heard two sounds almost simultaneously, the deep boom of the rifle and the sickening thwack of the arrow finding its mark. She looked up just in time to see Buck Kane stagger back, the arrow embedded in his shoulder. But she also saw Black Hawk jolt, a dark stain blossoming on his leather tunic high on his chest. He stumbled, his bow clattering on the rocks, and fell to one knee, his face contorted in pain. Down below, the standoff broke. Seeing Buck Kane hit, Gus Beale and his men opened fire with renewed fury. Marshal Grant, his choice made for him, wheeled his horse around and fired back at the posse, providing cover. Go! Black Hawk grunted at Lena, trying to rise. Get out of here! But she didn't run. The woman who had flinched at every raised voice, who had lived in terror for 2 years, didn't run. She grabbed Black Hawk's fallen bow and a spare arrow. She had watched him for weeks. She knew how it worked. With fumbling, desperate hands, she knocked the arrow, rose from behind the rock and aimed it, not at Buck Kane, but at the rope holding a large, precariously balanced boulder on the canyon rim, a remnant of an old rock slide. Gus Beale and his men were advancing on Marshal Grant. Buck Kane was trying to reload his rifle, his arm wounded. Lena let the arrow fly. It was a clumsy, wobbling shot, but it was true enough. The arrow sliced through the frayed rope. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then with a deep groan, the boulder shifted, tearing loose and crashing down the canyon side, bringing a torrent of rock and dirt with it. It didn't hit anyone directly, but it landed squarely in the path of the advancing posse, cutting them off from Marshal Grant and from the trail leading up to Lena and Black Hawk. The canyon filled with dust and the roar of the landslide. The battle was over. The dust settled, revealing a scene of chaos below. Gus Beale and his men were trapped, their path blocked by a mountain of fresh rubble. Marshal Grant sat on his horse coughing in the dust, his pistol still smoking. On the rim above, Buck Kane clutched his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he stared at Lena. He had been beaten by her. Lena rushed to Blackhawk's side. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but it was high in his chest, dangerously close to his lung. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "Marshal!" Lena screamed, her voice raw. Marshal Grant slowly, carefully made his way up the canyon wall. He approached them cautiously, his gun holstered, but his hand resting on the grip. His eyes took in the scene, the wounded Apache and the woman, who was clearly protecting him, not cowering from him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful, "are you Lena Kane?" "I am." She said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she tried to apply pressure to Blackhawk's wound. "And this man, he abducted you?" Grant asked, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "This man," Lena said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "saved my life. The man who is trying to kill me is my husband." From the opposite rim, Buck Kane began to scream obscenities at them, his voice filled with impotent rage. "She's a liar, a hysterical lying witch. She's bewitched by that savage. Kill them both, and I'll double the reward." But his spell was broken. The men below could see the truth now. They saw a U.S. Marshal siding against them. They saw their wealthy employer revealed as a raving madman. Their loyalty bought with coin evaporated in the face of a landslide and a federal officer. "It's over!" Marshal Grant shouted across the chasm. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." "You'll have to take me!" Buck Kane shrieked, fumbling to reload his rifle with one good arm. "That can be arranged," Grant said grimly. With practiced calm, the marshal raised his own rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was not aimed to kill. The bullet kicked up dirt right at Buck's feet. Panicked and off balance, Buck stumbled backward. His heel caught on the edge of the cliff. For a moment he teetered there, his eyes wide with shock. Then with a final, desperate cry, he fell, tumbling into the canyon he had sought to turn into a tomb. A heavy silence descended, broken only by Blackhawk's labored breathing. Lena ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat. As she did, the stiff stitched-in pages of the ledger rustled. She looked at Marshal Grant. "My husband didn't just try to murder me, Marshal," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "He's a thief and a mass murderer, and I have the proof." She carefully cut the stitches with Blackhawk's knife and pulled out the folded yellowed pages. She handed them to the marshal. He unfolded them, his eyes scanning the columns of names, dates, and damning figures. He saw the payment to Gus Beale for clearing the land. He saw the fraudulent deeds. He saw the cold, methodical accounting of Buck Kane's bloody rise to power. He looked from the pages to the wounded Apache warrior and then to the determined woman tending to him. The whole sordid story of Redemption Gulch was laid bare. "I'll be damned," Marshal Grant whispered. He tucked the pages safely into his coat. "Mrs. Kane, it appears this territory owes you both a great debt." 5 years had passed, and the relentless Texas wind had done its work smoothing the sharp edges of memory, just as it weathered the wooden crosses in the town cemetery. One of those crosses, unmarked and unvisited, belonged to Buck Kane. His dominion was a ghost of its former self, broken up and sold off by federal agents. Its stolen lands were returned to the public domain or sold to smaller, honest ranchers like the Millers. Redemption Gulch was a different town, now quieter and prouder. It had, in a way, finally begun to live up to its name. Marshal Grant, his hair now more salt than pepper, sat on the porch of the town's new schoolhouse, a sturdy building erected where one of Buck Kane's opulent barns once stood. He watched Lena Hart. She was no longer the haunted, fragile woman he'd met in the canyon. The years had etched fine lines of character around her eyes and mouth, and her hands, once soft and pale, were now capable and sure. She was listening intently to a young woman named Ruby who had arrived on the stagecoach a week prior with a shadowed eye and a story of a bad fall of her own. Lena wasn't just teaching reading and writing, she was teaching resilience. The schoolhouse had become a sanctuary, its back rooms a quiet refuge for women who had nowhere else to turn. Lena had built, with her own hands and heart, the shelter she had never had. When Ruby had gone back inside her shoulders, a little less slumped, Lena came and sat in the chair beside the marshal. For a few minutes they watched the children, playing in the yard, their laughter a sound of pure unburdened joy. "You've built something good here, Lena," Marshal Grant said, his voice a low rumble. "Something that matters." "I used the right materials," she replied, her gaze distant. "Stones from a collapsed foundation." She looked at the marshal. "Have you had any news?" It was a question she asked perhaps once a year. She never said a name. She never had to. Grant shifted in his seat. "Traders coming down from the north talk. They speak of the Numunu bands gathering near the reservation lands, trying to make a new life. They're scattered, but they're not broken." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They talk of a leader. Not a chief by birth, but a warrior who earned his place through wisdom. A man who negotiates with the agents, who fights for his people, not with arrows anymore, but with a voice as hard and true as flint. They call him the Wanderer." A small, sad smile touched Lena's lips. It was more than she could have hoped for. He had survived. He had found his purpose just as she had found hers. He was gathering his people. She was sheltering hers. Two different forms of the same essential work. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I'm glad he found his way home." "Some folks' homes ain't a place on a map," the marshal reflected, looking at her and the school she had built around her. "Sometimes it's the purpose you make for yourself." That evening, long after the children and Ruby were asleep, Lena stood on her porch, looking out at the vast, star-dusted plains. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and distance. She no longer scanned the horizon with a sense of loss, but with a feeling of quiet kinship. She knew that somewhere out there, under the same immense sky, he was looking out at the same stars, his heart filled with the same fierce duty to protect the vulnerable. Their paths had crossed in violence and pain, a brutal intersection of fate that had saved them both. They had parted as they must to follow the trails destined for them. But the mark they had left on each other was permanent. He had shown her that a shield could be found in the arms of a supposed enemy, and she had shown him that a single voice armed with the truth could bring down an empire. The sparrow, she thought, had found her perch, and across the great plains the hawk circled, watching over his own and in the vast silent heart of the West. That was enough. They took Black Hawk not to Redemption Gulch, but to the old Miller homestead. May Hale, a woman who knew true kindness when she saw it, tended to his wound with skill and compassion. Marshal Grant posted a deputy outside to ensure no misguided fool sought to claim the old bounty. The ledger pages caused an earthquake in the territory, with Gus Beale and his men captured and ready to talk in exchange for leniency. The full extent of the Kane Dominion's corruption was exposed. Federal investigators arrived, and the empire built on bones began to crumble. Lena stayed at the Miller farm until Black Hawk was strong enough to travel. The days were quiet. They rarely spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Two survivors from different worlds, bound by shared trauma and a hard-earned victory. Lena Hart had saved him on the canyon rim, and he had saved her from a life that was little more than a slow death. The day he was ready to leave, he found her standing alone, watching the sunset paint the plains. He wore simple buckskins, the ones provided by the marshal, his own tunic ruined in their fight for survival. "You'll be safe now," he said, his voice steady as if it were the truth of the land itself. "Yes," she replied softly. "Thanks to you." He turned to look at the vast open land stretching out before them. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "My path is not here," he said, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I will find what is left of my people. The Numunu are still here. We wander, but we are not gone." She wanted to ask him to stay. She wanted to tell him that she had never felt more at home than she did in the stark wilderness with him. It was simpler, freer than the gilded cage she had been trapped in, but she knew it was impossible. Their worlds had crossed, had merged for a time, but they couldn't stay together. "Will I see you again?" she asked, the question hanging in the cool evening air. Blackhawk reached out and for the first and only time gently touched the faded bruise on her cheek. It was a soft gesture, one of farewell, one of understanding, a bond between them that needed no more words. The hawk and the sparrow fly in the same sky. "Lena Hart," he said, using her full name for the first time, "but they do not share a nest." With one last look at her, a look that carried a world of gratitude and sorrow, he turned and walked to the pinto pony the marshal had procured for him. He mounted, and with a final nod, he rode off not into the sunset, but north toward the smoke-colored hills. As he became a smaller silhouette against the endless plains, the earth swallowed him whole. Lena Hart did not return to St. Louis. She stayed. She used what little inheritance she had left, what was left of Buck Kane's legitimate holdings, to buy the old schoolhouse and a small plot of land. She became a teacher, not just for children, like Cody Miller, but for women, women who were trapped, women who needed a safe harbor, women who needed to be reminded that even when their ribs were broken, their spirits didn't have to be. She never remarried. Some nights when the wind swept down from the Llano Estacado, she would stand on her porch, staring into the wild, unyielding darkness. She would listen as if she could hear the echo of a hawk's cry carried on the wind. The story of Lena Hart and the warrior Blackhawk is a reminder that sometimes the greatest cruelty wears a civilized mask and the truest shield is found in the most unexpected hands. Their tale teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. It's a story of how two people from warring worlds found common ground in their shared pain and forged a moment of justice in a land where justice was scarce. They were two separate trails, destined to cross but never to merge, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the West and on each other. If their incredible story of survival and unlikely alliance moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this tale with others who appreciate stories of the true untamed West, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that bring the past to life. Thank you for listening. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voice-over visual scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work